Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site is Mekala Krishnan, partner at McKinsey Global Institute at McKinsey & Company, Tony Perrotta, sustainability and regenerative economy expert at PA Consulting, Todd Zabelle, construction industry expert, and Tyler Rosenlicht, head of Natural Resource Equities at Cohen Steers. We're here to discuss navigating the physical realities of the energy transition and who the winners and losers are in both traditional and alternative sources of energy. It is great to have everyone with us. Certainly a key topic as we're thinking about policy evolution. Mika, let's kick it off with you and talk about the current environment when it comes to the energy transition and existing strategy. It seems as if we're coming to face reality here.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we've seen meaningful momentum towards the transition on many fronts, right? So we've seen technologies come down in cost. We've started to see finance flow. But as our research finds, and we actually just launched a big research report today on the physical realities of the transition, the fact remains we're still in very early stages of the transition. So as we look across the power sector, the mobility sector, the industry sector, what we find is that we've only deployed about 10% of the technologies that we would need by 2050. Where the deployment has occurred has been in the easiest use cases. I mean, think passenger EVs with short range, for example, right? And so we are in its very early stages, and this is a huge physical transformation that we're talking about. I mean, if you think about the energy system today, it's 60,000 power plants, it's 1 billion vehicles on the road, 7 billion tons, 8 billion tons of industrial materials that we produce, like steel and cement. So this is a massive physical transformation that is in its early stages, and there's a lot of challenges that lie ahead.
Yeah, it seems like we're coming to terms with some of these mandates, but Tony, at the end of the day, it's a multi-trillion-dollar market opportunity.
Absolutely, and the pragmatic reality is our energy usage is only going to continue to grow. We're going to need technologies that solve multiple problems at the same time. We can get into some examples later, but there are new unique things like biochar and alternatives to plastic that use up fossil fuel that may not need to. So there's exciting innovation ahead and a major market opportunity.
Yeah, and Todd, it's more about a portfolio of energies, not just one solution that's going to solve all the world's problems.
Yeah, and just to go back to the numbers for a sec, they're very staggering. Talking 100 trillion investment, right? We're a little bit delayed. McKinsey put out a report coming to 9.2 trillion per annum. I think we're going to have to even go further at some point because we're still not getting as fast as we want to go. And some of these technologies are coming in a little bit early and not working perhaps as well as they could, right? So simultaneously, we're going to transition, if you will, from one source of energy, hydrocarbons, to electrons, and at the same time, we have this demand that's increasing, and it just keeps increasing, right?
Yeah, and Tyler, you brought up a good point off camera earlier that perhaps the moniker isn't correct. It should be emissions transition versus energy.
Yeah, so our view, as everybody here has talked about, is we think the demand for energy globally is going to keep growing, and demand for energy is going to grow for 3 reasons. Population, we think, is going to keep growing. The economy is going to keep growing. And yes, we are going to see improving efficiency in terms of energy in and economic growth out. But as you look at those 3 things together, we just need more energy. It's an energy addition world. And so for us, we think the narrative is changing a little bit where it's less about energy transition and more about the emissions transition. Mm-hmm. And Bernstein actually put out a great report on this a couple weeks ago where they say, hey, it's important to sort of change the narrative a little bit because we need energy and we need to improve the emissions profile of it. And those 2 things can be in conflict, but we need to attack both sides of that.
Yeah, because you need energy to produce energy. At the end of the day, that's why electricity or solar or wind, it can't be a one-size-fits-all solution because there's so many different types of needs. But Mika, what I struggle with is the infrastructure needs to be in place before we deploy these emerging technologies. You could have all the EV cars you want, but if you can't charge consistently across the country.
Yeah, I mean, let me add a fourth, by the way, which is that there's a large part of the world that isn't sufficiently energized today, right? So if we think about developing countries, so it's actually 4 things that are driving energy demand. So yes, that's exactly right. So as part of this research, what we've done is what we think the most comprehensive stock take of all the physical challenges, the physical puzzle pieces that need to come together for the transition. And we've identified 25 of them. They include the performance of low emissions technologies, but also things like the supply chains that we need to build. We need to scale up mineral supply chains, for example, for rare earths, for lithium, so on and so forth. We need a whole range of infrastructure, T&D, EV charging stations, hydrogen charging stations. And so we've identified these 25 little puzzle pieces that all need to come together. When we look at these 25 puzzle pieces, The good news is that we find for about half of them, and that's about half of energy system related emissions, we are seeing a lot of momentum and progress, right? A bit to your point, there are technologies that are promising and we are seeing deployment. There's still a lot of scaling that needs to happen even in that half. But the big challenge is the other half, where again, about half of energy system related emissions sit. This is things like, how do we manage power when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow? How do we decarbonize steel and cement, which are really hard sectors to decarbonize? Half of energy system emissions sit there. These are challenges. We still have big technology performance gaps, massive scaling needs. We're talking 100x, 1000x scaling needs. And it's not just one part of the system that needs to be solved. It's many different things that need to come together. Yeah. So the rubber's really going to hit the road there.
And I would just maybe add on that, one of the challenges that we see is a lot of the growth in power and energy demand is baseload demand, where we need to make sure that the lights are on, the heating system is running, the AC system is running 24/7. You talk about data centers and AI, that is very baseload. We need the energy all the time. And a lot of new technologies, they're great from an emissions perspective, but they oftentimes have intermittency issues. And yeah, maybe some batteries could help harden that system, but the reality is the demands on the grid and the demands on energy are becoming very, very, I need it 24/7. And so, making sure that what we're investing in can satisfy that is a really important part of the problem as well.
Yeah.
Can I just help dimensionalize that? So people talk a lot about AI and data centers and how they're increasing energy demand. And it's true, they are massively increasing energy demand. Globally, they contributed to about 2% of power demand in the last year. They're expected to get to about 4 or 5%. The US percent was higher, it was about 10%. But think about that, right? The whole conversation is data centers, and that's 2 or 4% of global energy demand. In the energy transition, we're talking about scaling up the power system and low emissions power capacity 10 times by 2050 versus today. So the scale of what we're talking about with data centers is a tiny fraction of what this energy transition involves. This is a massive, huge transformation that lies ahead.
May I add a little more color to that?
Yeah, of course.
So what's interesting, looking at it from the engineering construction perspective, you have a workforce that's retiring out. We're going to be short, just in the US, 600,000 workers here pretty soon, right? People that could weld and do electrical work, right? We have the same industrial supply base around the world. When you get down to the industrial level, and you're talking about switchgear, circuit boards, generators, steel, it's the same players, right? Now, we have to build the equivalent of a Paris every week, right? And at the same time do 100 trillion, or let's say 9.2 trillion in energy work. And then we also have to have this digital infrastructure transformation that's going on. The demands on the supply chain, whether it's labor or it's the equipment or the basic materials that are going to go in this, are far exceeding that. At the same time, I think you have some of those people in the industrial base taking a scarcity marketing approach to this, where they get to level out and get their ARR over the long range by just holding back, right? So it's going to be very interesting how this plays out from the supply side.
I do think, though, the comment made earlier about let's focus on how to capture the emissions is going to become essentially critical, right? How do you capture that carbon and store it long term? Because those needs are not going to go away. Air conditioning and cooling, immensely critical. We're going to begin to use energy for desalination of water. I mean, we will run out of fresh water. So capturing that carbon is going to be a massive.
This might be an elementary question, but how do you capture carbon? How do you quantify that?
Sure. So there's one new technology that's actually an old technology seeing resurgence, and that's biochar. In essence, you take bioorganic material and without the presence of oxygen, create charcoal. What that does is it binds that carbon that was created in those plants and can store it for hundreds and even thousands of years, and it brings a whole host of other benefits. Water reduction, soil enhancement, et cetera.
Right, so this is more than just the energy transition. We're talking about a number of areas that you're looking at alternative sources of output at the end of the day.
Exactly. What is clean and plainly available is this is a complex systems-based challenge. You can't tackle energy alone. It's going to have ramifications across multiple industries.
Exactly right. It's a systems engineering problem.
You talked about an emissions transition. I mean, one way to think about this is we need to transition the energy system, and that's not just energy supply, it's also energy demand, how we use energy. We need a materials transition. This is your point about supply chain. Right. We also need to think about food and agriculture, because that also contributes to emissions. Forestry contributes as a carbon sink to your question about how you store carbon. So this is actually this massive integrated transition that needs to happen across energy, materials, food, and agriculture, and all together. The problem is there is no silver bullet. Everything needs to come together if we are to get. And
over a century of building a system that all works together, that's going to be transitioned very rapidly, right?
Yeah, right. It's going to require public-private partnerships as well, right? And it's not And let's talk about regulation for a moment here too. It takes time to regulate, and the technology moves quicker, which is a big challenge, Tyler.
Well, one of our favorite acronyms that's sort of changed recently is, when you think about the regulatory permitting and approval process for large-scale infrastructure projects, we think the world used to be a NIMBY world, which is not in my backyard. Hey, I don't want you to build a power plant or a carbon capture facility here, but you can build it in the neighborhood next door. Paul Sankey from Sankey Research coined the acronym, we're now in a bananas world. And a bananas world is a build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything world. So you think about trying to build all the industrial assets.
It's very depressing.
Yeah, again, bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And I think it's irrespective of what country you're in. I think this is, in a lot of places you have the same challenge. It's irrespective of who's in office. There tends to be a big fight back against building a lot of the stuff that we need to retool this global energy system, this global industrial system, and so forth. And so I think that's a major problem. We need to have permitting reform. We need to have a willingness to allow the projects and investments to be made to get the grid, get the industrial backbone of our economy and the global economy set up for all the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm just trying to break it down and conceptualize it a bit. You know how challenging it is just to do permitting on your own home, right? Whether you're building a deck or you're moving, you have to get all these permits. Imagine doing that on such a massive scale.
And it's not just traditional energy that has trouble getting permitted. One of the toughest things today is permitting transmission lines. So if you're producing electricity in one place and you need to move it to a place that consumes the electricity, oftentimes it can take you a decade to get the transmission lines built. And a lot of it is not the construction process, it's the permitting side. And I think that's a really big challenge.
Let's talk about some opportunities for a moment here. Well, but the thing is, it is important to have these conversations because mandates need to be met and infrastructure needs to be built. So I feel like it's a big come to reality conversation. But Mika, let's talk about some of the opportunities and alternatives that are out there.
Yeah, so going back to our stock take, right, these 25 challenges we identified, as I said, about half of them are areas where we've seen a lot of progress, where technologies are starting to get mature, and really it's a question of how do you accelerate deployment. So examples of that might be electric vehicles. Actually, what we find when you look at the numbers is that 70% of the needs of households can be the range needs of households, how long they need to drive. So 70% of household needs can be met by existing average electric vehicles that are on the road today. So that's a place where we've actually seen a lot of progress on technology. We need to, of course, continue to innovate and continue to improve the density of batteries. Another example is heat pumps. Heat pump technologies actually work incredibly well today. About 95% of people live in areas where heat pumps work perfectly fine. They function even despite the coldest temperatures. So I was talking to somebody earlier today that lives in Maine and has a heat pump in his home and it works perfectly fine. And so we've seen examples of this time and time again where we have technologies that work and it's really a question of executing on those technologies. But there are these other areas where we need to continue to drive the innovation engine, and it's not just innovation with a small I, meaning improving individual technologies, but also innovating about how the system as a whole comes together.
Yeah.
I think at its most basic, we're talking about material science. We really need advancements there. It touches on every single industry we've brought up to date. One example is even a smaller example, plastics and plastic alternatives. Today, plastics production accounts for 10% of all fossil fuels used today. If we can find alternatives and reposition that into critical infrastructure, that's already a 10% increase. So I'm of the opinion that material science, the carbon capture that we spoke about earlier are going to be the key levers.
Yeah.
I would just say from our perspective, we think there's going to be huge winners and huge losers across both the traditional energy landscape and the alternative landscape. And we think if you can find the opportunities that are going to be sort of the best-in-class companies in the next decades, you're going to do really well. And so in the traditional side, we think companies that can utilize existing infrastructure, be it natural gas pipelines and so forth, to help facilitate an improvement in emissions and also provide baseload power, they could do really well. On the alternative side, one thing that we really are excited about is nuclear technologies. We think nuclear is a really good solution for a lot of the problems that we've all talked about here. Clearly there's cost and regulatory and permitting issues, but we think that's going to have to be a big part of what the energy grid of the future is going to look like. And if you can sort of find opportunities within nuclear, you should do well.
Todd, what about solving the challenge of the construction industry and being able to scale there? Is it possible? Because the reskilling or skilling of the workforce, you have to be able to put these things together at the end of the day.
Yeah, we're the guys that no matter what cocktail party you're at, you say, hey, I'm in construction, I got a bathroom job that's gone, my kitchen's bad. Right?
I was about to say exactly that. But
I would say that it has a long way to go. And the problem is it's a service-based industry. I saw a situation the other day where a contractor negotiated an excellent agreement for themselves, and I think that their customer will never, a startup, ever come to fruition because the agreement is so onerous, right? I think this is going to take an all hands on deck approach, and the good news is we're here today and we're all talking about it, and people are trying. I think that's what really matters.
Let's talk about policy and the upcoming election. I know before you had mentioned, Tyler, that it's not as impactful as one might think, but there's a couple things that are going on. Let's look at the reversal of Chevron as an example. Some of these agencies provide the expertise in this space.
Yeah, from my perspective, when we talk about how policy is going to affect things, we think we are going into a place where there will be an emissions transition and we'll get a much cleaner grid. So in 2050, we think we're going to be a lot better off than we are today. I think policy can influence the path. So there will be a fast adoption policy approach where we can actually see an acceleration in terms of a lot of the trends we're talking about, or it'll be a slower going path. Hey, we're actually going to rely on traditional hydrocarbons for a little bit longer. So to us, policy doesn't affect where we go, it just affects the speed with which we get there. And it's about understanding what's being subsidized, what's being, getting more government incentives and so forth, and sort of changing the speed with which we're going to where we're eventually going to be.
Yeah, I mean, Tony, this might seem a little bit abstract, but the younger generation, the future of the workforce, sustainability and the environment is core to their ethos, right? I wonder if that will help to be more influential and provide the path.
I think there is a critical concern where we are relying on regulatory to make the changes, and we're beginning to see some corporations slowly step back 2030 and 2040 goals. Meanwhile, those younger demographics more and more are realizing that sustainability shouldn't be a landscape of trade-offs. I want the same experience, an amazing experience, and still have it be good for the world and myself and my life. The companies that align with those beliefs are going to be the key winners and leaders of tomorrow.
Well, I mean, they're going to attract the best talent too.
Exactly.
Right.
And I'd like to add one more part to that, which is the actual capital, right? So the big energy guys are trying. They're trying very hard, right? Now they've pulled back a little bit because it's very challenging to achieve what they're trying to do. And the capital has to stay in there and support them and not pull back, because if you take it out of the big incumbent guys, they have the capability and the know-how and the resources to do this kind of stuff. If you take them off the table, you have a real problem. And so the capital's got to hold strong and keep them in business and not run off to the latest thing that somebody's dreamed up this week, right?
Yeah, I mean, people ask me all the time, am I an optimist or a pessimist about this topic? And my lens is I'm a pragmatist about it, right? So I think the way we should approach this is there are things that work today, and we really need to figure out how do we debottleneck those things and get them going, reduce permitting timelines. I mean, you talked about T&D, but if you think about scaling a mining project from inception to execution, that can take 17 years. So we really need to think about how do we get this execution engine going on the things that we know work. For the harder things, I think to your point about incumbent companies, there are quote-unquote low-hanging fruit, things that we can do already today that start to reduce emissions, things like energy efficiency, things like material efficiency. One of the analyses we did said that there's 5 gigatons of abatement that we can get just purely through energy efficiency. We're emitting about 40 gigatons in the energy system today, 5 gigatons just through energy efficiency. And so it's also, while we solve these innovation challenges, these infrastructure challenges, these big things that take time, there's also the low-hanging fruit that we need to lean into today.
All right.
The last thing I'd maybe add on just the sort of traditional energy businesses and so forth is, there was a CEO of a major natural gas pipeline company that about 5 years ago said to me, hey, I used to think that our business core competency was moving natural gas from point A to point B. I now think our core competency is building and developing large-scale infrastructure projects. Being a natural gas pipeline owner means you can interface with regulators, you can raise the capital, you can hire the labor force, you can develop the projects. So that's a major skill set in these legacy incumbent companies that we think should be leveraged. They can be part of the solution. They can transition their businesses if they reframe how they think they add value and if they can make good investments in the sort of growth opportunities that we're talking about.
We're leaving it on a positive note. Thank you everyone for all your insights and joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.